The harsh glare of the Salem Hospital emergency room fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, but all I could focus on was the icy draft cutting through my gown. Just 2 hours ago, my Honda Civic was crushed on Interstate 5 by a semi-truck that ran a red light, leaving me with 3 fractured ribs and a punctured left lung. My emergency contact had been dialed by the trauma surgeon, who placed the call on speakerphone right beside my gurney. Through a heavy haze of pain medication, I listened as my mother clear and unbothered stated they would only come if I actually died, because 16 guests were arriving for Thanksgiving dinner in a few hours. The doctor froze, slowly lowering his hand, leaving an unbearable silence in the room as I closed my eyes and realized what true abandonment felt like. 22 hours later, I woke up isolated in an intensive care unit room with no flowers, no family, and no soft words of comfort. The space was completely empty until a hospital billing specialist walked through the door, carrying a small, heavy walnut box tied with brown twine. She explained that a quiet, silver-haired gentleman in a dark jacket had paid my entire $112,000 bill in full before leaving the package. He had left strict instructions that I was not to open the contents until I made it back to my apartment, leaving me with a burning mystery. I had spent 16 painful years believing I was completely unwanted, but that unmarked box was about to reveal how deeply I had been lied to. My name is Judith Vance, and for years I have poured my life into working as a nighttime pediatric nurse at a specialized medical center in Portland, Oregon. My job requires me to stay awake through the darkest hours, holding the hands of sick children whose parents cannot be at their bedside. I live a quiet, solitary life in a modest studio apartment, balancing student loans and rent while making just enough to get by. Being alone has always been my reality, mostly because my family dynamic was structured to make me feel completely invisible. My younger sister, Clarissa, was always the golden child who met every single expectations my parents set, while I was treated like an inconvenient afterthought. Growing up, my parents, Richard and Eleanor Vance, made it abundantly clear that Clarissa was their pride and joy. She married young, bought a massive home in an affluent suburb, and gave them their first grandchild, whereas my career in nursing was constantly dismissed. During our last shared holiday dinner, my father openly mocked my line of work, comparing my hands-on care for sick children to my sister's corporate promotions. When I gently spoke up to defend my purpose, he simply brushed me off and turned the conversation back to Clarissa. I should have cut ties with them back then, but a small part of me kept hoping that maybe one day they would finally see my worth. The pattern of emotional neglect had actually started back when I was 14 years old and experienced severe abdominal distress during school. When I got home doubled over in pain, my mother told me I was being overly dramatic and instructed me to take over-the-counter painkillers. 6 hours later, my appendix ruptured, forcing me into emergency midnight surgery while my parents blamed me for not communicating my symptoms properly. The exact same thing happened years later when I suffered a severe migraine and a stress fracture, both times leaving me to handle medical crises completely on my own. They had trained themselves to ignore my pain, which is why they dismissed the trauma surgeon's call on Thanksgiving Day as just another cry for attention. There was another deep piece of my past that my parents had actively buried, involving my beloved grandfather, Arthur Vance. He passed away 3 years ago in late 2022, but I was never invited to the funeral or even told that he was in hospice care. My parents claimed it was a tiny private service and that they did not want to burden my busy work schedule. In reality, my grandfather had suddenly disappeared from my life when I turned 13, leaving me to believe he had simply grown distant. I spent over a decade assuming he had forgotten about me, entirely unaware of the cruel actions my parents had taken behind closed doors. On the morning of the accident, I woke up exhausted in my apartment after working a demanding 12-hour night shift at the hospital. I was exhausted, but I packed my bag to make the 2-hour drive down south to my parents' house for Thanksgiving dinner. A cold, demanding text from my mother popped up on my phone screen, asking if I was going to be on time without a single inquiry about my well-being. By early afternoon, traffic on the highway was gridlocked, and as I neared an intersection, a massive commercial truck barreled through a red light. The violent impact caved in my driver's side door, shattering glass everywhere and pinning me inside the smoking frame of my car. When the paramedics finally cut me out and rushed me to the emergency room, the medical team immediately recognized the severity of my internal injuries. The attending surgeon dialed my parents to secure consent and urged them to drive to the hospital right away. Instead of showing concern, my father questioned the severity of the situation, claiming I had a history of exaggerating minor health issues. My mother could be heard clearly in the background, insisting that they could not cancel their catered holiday dinner for my drama. The doctor ended the call with a cold tone, looking at me with deep pity as they prepped me for emergency surgery. I survived the 4-hour operation, waking up the next day surrounded by humming heart monitors and a sharp ache in my chest. When I picked up my phone, there were no frantic messages asking if I was alive, only texts from Clarissa complaining that I had missed dinner. A kind floor nurse named Brenda checked my vitals and noticed the completely blank visitor log hanging at the foot of my bed. Shortly after, the billing clerk entered with the mysterious wooden box, revealing that an unknown stranger had cleared my massive medical debt. I held the heavy walnut casing against my chest, feeling a strange surge of warmth amidst the bitter coldness of my family's betrayal. I was discharged a few days later and took a long, quiet ride back to my Portland apartment to begin my long physical recovery. Walking up the 3 flights of stairs to my door was excruciating, every breath firing sharp pains through my healing ribs. I placed the mysterious wooden box on my small dining table, leaving it unopened for nearly 2 weeks because I was terrified of what it contained. During those 14 days of silence, my mother only left one cold voicemail, expressing frustration that I was ignoring her Christmas planning texts. Sitting alone in the dark, my mind kept drifting back to warm memories of my grandfather, remembering the gentle way he used to speak to me. I clearly remembered sitting on his lap when I was 8 years old while he showed me his vintage gold pocket watch with a worn leather strap. He told me that the ticking hands represented a love that never stopped, promising that the watch would belong to me when the time was right. My father had walked into the room back then, angrily cutting our moment short and scolding my grandfather for filling my head with useless foolishness. Another memory surfaced from when I was 12, starring in a school play where my parents skipped the performance for Clarissa's sports game. My grandfather sat in the front row alone, clapping louder than anyone else and promising me that he would always show up for me. By the time I turned 13, those peaceful visits stopped entirely after a fierce, loud argument broke out between my father and grandfather behind closed doors. I remembered hearing my grandfather shouting that my parents were destroying my self-esteem by constantly favoring Clarissa over me. My father retaliated by banning him from the house, severing our bond and forcing my grandfather out of my life permanently. For 16 years, I carried the heavy burden of believing my grandfather had simply walked away, not realizing he had been forcibly pushed out. The truth had been carefully hidden from me, but the walnut box sitting on my table held the key to unlocking everything. On a quiet night in mid-December, I finally reached across the table and untied the brown twine securing the wooden box. Inside lay my grandfather's gold pocket watch, gleaming under the warm lamplight, with a fresh inscription carved onto the back casing. The engraving read that I was never truly alone, dated just days before his passing in November of 2022. Beneath the watch was a thick handwritten letter, a flash drive, and a set of legal documents detailing a secret struggle I knew nothing about. My hands trembled violently as I unfolded the yellowed paper and began reading my grandfather's final words to me. In the emotional letter, my grandfather explained how my parents had threatened to file restraining orders if he ever tried to contact me directly while I was a minor. He revealed that he had attended every major milestone from a distance, watching my nursing graduation from the very back row of the auditorium. Furthermore, the documents showed that he had set up a substantial trust fund in my name, which my parents had repeatedly tried to challenge legally and seize for Clarissa. When he fell terminal, he hired a private firm to monitor my safety, which is how his legal representative managed to step in and pay my hospital bill instantly. Tears streamed down my face as I played the audio file saved on the flash drive, hearing my grandfather's soft, familiar voice fill my quiet apartment. He spoke directly to me, apologizing for the years we lost and reassuring me that my capacity for love and empathy was my greatest strength. He urged me to break free from the toxic dynamic my parents had created and to use the remaining trust funds to build a peaceful, fulfilling life. For the first time in my entire existence, the crushing weight of feeling unloved and unwanted completely lifted from my chest. The following morning, my mother called my phone again, demanding to know if I was going to purchase expensive gifts for Clarissa's child for the upcoming holiday. I listened quietly to her sharp tone before calmly telling her that I knew the full truth about my grandfather, the trust fund, and their cruel lies. Silence filled the line before she attempted to make excuses, but I simply cut her off and told her never to contact me again. I hung up the phone, walked over to the window, and strapped my grandfather's gold watch securely around my wrist. I finally realized that family is not defined by cold bloodlines, but by the genuine love of those who choose to stand by you.